Peace. This is the Ask Your Old Head podcast with Justice Raji. My guest today is the one and only Jamal Green.
What's up?
Peace. How you doing today?
I'm doing all right. I can't complain.
Right. So, I always start the show, or I like to start with giving you a chance to just give a shout out of love to whomever you feel needs to get their name immortalized on tape. So go.
I'm going to shout out my mom, Dr. Cynthia Crawford Green, my dad, Dr. William Wyman Green, and my partner, Sophia, and her son, and, a little guy I love also, Quentin. So just giving a shout out to the whole crew.
Word up. Peace. So we'll just get started. So for you, what is a practice or a principle, standard, something that you try to hold yourself to, that you just try to activate in your life?
Right. Principle I try and hold to, I think especially now as I'm I'm well into my early 30s and trying to get on deeper with my career, and having been teaching more at the university, I find myself just increasingly less patient with obvious statements of racism and sexism and homophobia and that kind of stuff, and I just don't have a lot of patience for it anymore. Right. And folks will often say something that's just kind of foul and incorrect. And, I'm just I'm just not going to do it anymore. I'm just not going to take it. And, this comes both from black folks and non-black folks, clearly being in Portland, oftentimes I'll hear some of this stuff more from non-black folks about right. Black people. And I'll just be yeah, no, that's not true. Or I'll just be nah, I'm not going to have that. I'm just not going to play that game with you. And, it breeds some conflict on occasion, at the Broadway, the bar that we've met at a couple of times, there's a group of old dudes who sit at the bar, and there's a couple of real hard, Trump supporters in them. And if I go in there on the wrong day at the wrong time, we just end up yelling at each other across the bar, man. I'm just yo, it's not cool, man. It doesn't fit that way. So yeah, that's probably something that I'm in there now. I just don't let certain stuff that, a lot of people be hey, just let it wash off your back, or it's just boys being boys in the case of sexism or homophobia. And I'm just nah, man, it's just not going to go that way anymore. I do not think that women are less than in any particular kind of way. My brother is gay, which ultimately doesn't matter because gay people are humans, and
indeed,
right, and they deserve respect and everything else. So, I'm just I guess I'm at an age now where I just don't care anymore. I'm just nah, it's fine.
Indeed. Would you say there was a moment where you just decided I had enough, or was it a gradual process? What do you think got you there?
Right. I think it was probably more of a gradual process, I think as with many things with me, a lot of it was kind of a gradual process, online on Twitter, where, I think a couple of years ago, actually following some stuff that Bo said, where Bo was basically look, man, I'm not going to sit here and debate my humanity with these racists. And, I had heard him say that a bunch of times before, but it never really stuck with me until finally there was just like this one afternoon where folks were seriously basically trying to argue, that that cop shooting black people was okay. This is maybe 2015. So it's still early-ish in the Black Lives Matter movement. But Black Lives Matter had been pretty decently established by then. And I was no, man, I'm not going to sit here and debate whether or not black people should be shot in the street, shot in the street like dogs. And if that's where you're starting from, I just don't got to talk to you at all. And that's perfectly fine. I used to say, I'm not going to lose any sleep. And you're clearly at a point where you're not going to be actually persuaded that black people are people. That's kind of just a deep, almost ontological difference. It's not going to work.
All right. Peace. Thank you. So, just one more follow up to that. Do you think, because I think the thing that is often positioned is almost people will behave that way due to just a lack of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. That they just don't know. So maybe if they read the right thing, or they see the right speech or whatever, that it's going to turn around. I myself am tired of that idea. Right. And but my question to you would be, where do you think sort of people's the concept of exposure, or someone teaching someone some of these things, where does that land with you when you hear that sentiment?
Right. Yeah. So I teach, and I want to be a professor, of which a good part of that is teaching, so I definitely believe in the power of teaching, and the power of exposure to help people change their ideas. I think for me, it's more so like, what's the starting point that people are in, you know? So again, they do end up being extreme cases, but I think kind of good cases to illustrate what's going on is that, around some of like the Black Lives Matter stuff, especially around like these police shootings, like there's a difference between starting with some folks who insist on like, this person should have been like more respectful or blah, 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 or, there's some kind of like extenuating, there's some kind of extenuating circumstance here as opposed to someone who's like, I feel like police they need to shoot more people and black people are more criminal and that's why more of them are dying, right? And those are like two very different arguments. I think they're both wrong, but I think that one actually has space to be able to talk to a person about being like, hey, man, let's actually talk about the context in which a lot of this stuff occurs and the context and the communities that do interact like differently around these kinds of things, as opposed to being like, well, actually black people aren't more like bad or criminal or evil, right? Or like on like a fundamental sense, right? And again, like I'm not going to argue that anymore, right? So I do think that teaching matters and can help, but at the same time, I do think we need to be aware of the point where certain people are at, and if they're actually like open to being taught or even open to like trying to discuss certain things around that, and as a teacher or professor or whatever, you can't always assume that people are on the same level that you are, and like it's going to be a harder row to hoe for certain students or certain classes, even like entire classes moving for stuff.
Indeed. All right, well, thank you. We're going to come back around to Twitter a little later, and a couple other things, but we'll move forward. So the next thing I'd like to ask you is just so relationships broadly defined. What's something that you've learned now that maybe you didn't do as well in the past?
Yeah, just being more open and communicative. Like with your partner and being honest and whatnot. Just trying to be open and honest and like, just be transparent with that stuff. And like if you don't want to do something or you're dissatisfied about something, like don't go behind someone's back, or don't just like keep it in and have like something like fester and go, because like it's not going to get solved if you don't say anything. And if you figure out that, hey, like you're the person in the relationship, whether it's an intimate relationship or not intimate relationship, if they're not interested in listening to you or working with you to try and get by an issue, then probably you need to, you need to walk away and not stay there. And, like just, ultimately end up wasting like everyone's time in terms of what's going on.
All right. Indeed. Do you think that is there a limit to sort of limit's not maybe the right word. What do you think is sometimes, or even speaking for your own self, would have been a barrier in the past to being honest about a situation with someone? What was sort of the substrate? I'm
pretty like conflict averse, actually, and I still am. I'm trying to do better with it, but like I don't like a whole lot of conflict, and that's an easy way to avoid conflict is just to not mention something or to lie. Like on the real, and then you just go on and do your other thing in the dark. So I think that's mainly the thing, at least for me, is like a conflict averse kind of nature, Now I know, and there's some people, who want to have like their cake and eat it too and all that other kind of stuff. And, but for me, it wasn't necessarily like that. For me, it was like this conflict averse thing. But, part of being an adult is like, you got to have like harder conversations and do all that other kind of stuff. So I think for me, that's really what it was.
Indeed. All right. Yeah, I think I always think, and I, as in some of my own personal works that I've been doing, reflecting on, kind of a behavioral, I guess, call it policy that I figured out for myself was to try to be as honest as possible about certain things, with a degree and understanding of like compassion of context and timing. Right. You might not want to be honest about, baby, this ain't really working out, at the family cookout.
Exactly.
That might not be the time to let somebody know, at least in that type of relationship, that this ain't working. Exactly. Or, in another context, maybe if you and another person in the community don't see eye to eye, calling them out in a public meeting.
Right.
may not be the best time to let them know you're not
exactly
on the same page with them. However, you do need to let them know at some point. However, like I said, that the persistence of lying about stuff as a societal thing, like, eats at me.
Right.
So, peace. So, our last thing of my main questions before we move into the other things. So just for you right now, what is just really important in your life? Like, what are you either working on or doing or even thinking that's just really, really important for you?
No, for me, like, it's going to be like mad stereotypical, for folks who are in grad school or went through grad school. But, my main thing right now is the dissertation, so like I am knee deep in the dissertation. My advisors, my committee would like me to defend come the spring, and I'm finishing off my first chapter, and I got to get the second and third chapter like up and running and going. So that's really like the primary thing. And, it's just like this huge thing that's like forever in the background, and it has to get done. And the way my scholarships and whatnot are set up, like, it's got to get done by the spring, or, like, there's going to be some real issues. So, that's definitely like the biggest thing. And, it's hard to describe it to folks who haven't gone through something like it before, but it's just this massive project, and it's your thing, and that can be incredibly empowering in some ways, and in other ways, it's incredibly, like, terrifying in its own way, because like, you're trying to make your own thing, you're trying to get it clean, you want to get it approved, and then ultimately, especially if you're trying to do like the academic job thing, you're trying to make this thing into something that other people will want to be able to read and be accepted by like the greater, like, your greater intellectual community, whatever that happens to be. So yeah, that's the thing right now.
All right. Yeah, I guess I'd say I've ridden sidecar as family member with a family member that's finishing the dissertation, and I guess I've had the fortune to sit with other people who were doing dissertations at one point or another. Can you, because I think it's something that sometimes, like, folks in some way intellectually or, like, I don't know, consciously hear the idea, oh, it's like school and it's a lot of work.
Right.
Can you just maybe describe the feeling of the experience as it's been for you so far, just in a way that maybe is a little more descriptive of how it feels?
Right. So I guess in how it feels, I guess part of it is trying to talk about like what it is that you're actually doing, right? So there are a lot of people who are good at school, right? Like I was pretty good at school, or maybe okay depending on if you ask my parents. But I was pretty good at school, right? You go, you do your assignments, you answer some questions on a test, and then you move on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. And there's a good number of people who are pretty good at doing that. But the thing about the dissertation is that, you're no longer going to someone else's class, answering someone else's questions, doing someone else's assignment. Mm-hmm. And at the end of like 10 weeks or 12 weeks, you go and do something else. This is something that's all you, that you're going to be carrying and doing for, on the fast end, a year, on the slower end, maybe 3 to 4 years of focusing almost purely on that project. Mm-hmm. And, if you get up on a day and you don't do any work on it, and, some of those things happen, then you don't get any progress. And, you look up after a few weeks and you realize I've done nothing for a variety of reasons, right? Like you may have some like legit reasons as to why you couldn't do work for what's going on, but, nothing gets done if you don't push it. Whereas just for school, at the end of 10 or 12 weeks, there's going to be a final. Right. And even if you like goofed off for like 3/4 of that term, if your professor's like, hey, the final's worth like 50% of the grade, like if you just rock it, you pull your all-nighter for 3 or 4 nights, and then you go and rock out the grade, you're good. Right. But for the dissertation, you cannot cram, you cannot write, like 150 pages within a single night, and all this other kind of stuff. If you're doing any kind of like qualitative data analysis like that, it's impossible to do your like 20 or 30 interviews, right? Like in 2 days, right? Like it's just not physically possible. And even if you could, like the process of trying to transcribe stuff and code it and actually like work with like making meaning and knowledge out of that, it's an incredibly like labor intensive kind of thing. And again, there's no real external pressure to do it. It's such a huge internal kind of thing. And, you know, like, I think a lot of people don't understand it as that particular kind of grind, whereas for other things, they do understand, like, yo, man, like, I wake up and I grind and I work on, like, I worked on, like, however many beats for, like, a summer. And it's like, yeah, man, you know, it's the exact same thing. I had to get up and I had to read, like, 300 pages of, like, boring planning memos to find like 5 paragraphs that have the information that I need, you know, right. And that's part of the grind and like making it go. And it's incredibly lonely and isolating by definition,
right.
You know, and then at the end, you're going to have a bunch of people who are going to do their best to shoot holes in
it. That shooting holes in it part, I think I feel like people should know about, but I think people still don't really know about. As it was described to me, independent, and I don't know if this is consistent across all institutions, but basically any other doctoral person with a doctorate, I don't know if it's someone that has to be from that school or they just happen to be at that school, but they can show up to your, defense, is it? That's the right term? Mm-hmm. And just kind of decide to go at you about it. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. So I believe the vast majority of institutions, and I know at Portland State, your defense is actually a public event, and you are required to publicize it to the university as a whole. So most anyone can come off the street and try and lob some questions at you. The only good thing is that, depending on the makeup of your committee, is that it's the people on your committee who make the final decision. Right? So they're really the only people that you have to worry about. At the same time, if you have some person who just comes in off the street and they do ask, like, a legit question and you don't look like you can answer it, then clearly your committee is going to, like, not look kindly upon that thing. But yeah, the dissertation defense is a public event, and and I think especially at a public institution, like most any person off the street, if they want, can, like, if they see the flyer or they see, like, an email alert, they can come through and sit down, and there's a space in the question and answer session for them to ask a question. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it is this weird thing where, like, most anyone, if they wanted to,
could roll in.
Yeah, exactly. But fortunately, people got to work and do all that other kind of thing. So they're not coming to most defenses.
It's got me thinking about, as we've talked before about sort of like alternative channels to challenge the thing that we're wrestling with, and like if we just went all out to just be showing up, especially at a very either at a body that has some level of perceived importance, so to speak, and we just started showing up posse deep with mad questions, just grilling, just dry roasting dudes. Like, wait, tell me more about this theory you got.
Exactly.
We went to the Harvard, whomever, the Ivy League school, and just like people researched, came with papers, came with like 5-6 of the team.
Yeah.
Like how could we push something that nobody, people would be thrown off. Like, wait, who are these people?
Right.
How did they get here? I don't know who would pay for that. But, just as an alternative model of challenge, this came to my mind when you started talking about
that. No, it's true. But and you also kind of have, like, the inverse is like an alternative model of support. So something that I really like is that, at least in my department, like, we have a tradition, like, if someone goes to defend, like, a whole bunch of us we will go in and we will sit there and act as support, and we will try and grab coffee for folks or some snacks and things like that. So all they have to worry about is doing the defense, and I really like that about my department. And I don't know if a lot of other departments have that same kind of dynamic, but there is this thing where it's like, hey, like, you are not alone. You have a support system here. And it also helps you to be able to focus on other stuff, So if you can talk to someone, you could say, yo, man, I called up Starbucks. I got some coffee. Here's like $18. Can you go grab it and get it set up for me? I'm going to finish off these slides, right? And that's what I did for my boy Dylan, and that's what I did for his defense. And I also got I think some pastries from the bakery down by my spot there too for that day. Because look, the defense is stressful enough. So you should help your folks out if you can. So that's I think there is there about, like, we have this, like, collective sense of challenge, but we can also have, like, a collective sense of support, at least internally, for some kind of things. Kind of cool.
Yeah, that's a sort of I mean, I guess it's hilarious because I mean, like the collegial energy, the idea, and it's sometimes I worry about folks sort of embracing that idea of even whatever specific, you know, post high school type education you're going to, but even like if you're going to college, especially like looking at it as, hey man, we all need to get through this process, and not just as sort of like, well, you're on your own now, right? Like you do it, you know. It's and I think, I mean, I feel like my own experience of graduate education was just a master's, but even within that experience, there was a sort of camaraderie amongst each other. Like everybody's going to like, where you at with your, you know, we did in our it's called a work sample, the end of the thing for our. It was like, you know, where you at with your work sample? You doing okay? Da da da. And like, you know, I think I want to say one of my classmates, cohort members, may have either had some kind of computer malfunction, and it was like, I lost all the stuff. You know what I mean? And you're like, you get ache because you're like, you know, I think my thing ended up being like 90 pages or something with citations and
that's legit,
notes and all the little parts and everything. And to imagine any piece of that gets lost, it's like, like if you did I did a teaching program, we had to do a specific like in class assignment. Like there's no way to replicate that besides getting in a classroom and doing it again. You know what I mean? Like, you know, so you don't really don't want to lose it. But I wonder sometimes when folks are maybe outside of that stream, how they understand that. Word. Well, appreciate you. So I'm going to pivot and ask you a urban planning economic development question.
Cool.
I didn't give you any preparation, but before I even do that, could you give just what would be your definition? Because economic development is a thing people like to say.
Right.
I've been in different organizations. I'm involved in different things where people have we need economic development team. Right. You know what we need over there? We need to get that on this economic development. Mm-hmm. What, you know, could you give in your own words what you see economic development as?
So, as with many things, you know, there's like multiple definitions depending on who you follow. And, you know, I follow in particular like progressive school of urban planning and economic development. There's this book, I'm not going to remember the quote exactly, but there's this book, I believe it's called Economic Revitalization. It's by Joan Fitzgerald and Nancy Greenlee. It's got this nice little blue cover. And they talk about different kinds of economic development policies. And for me, you know, they have this definition of economic development, you know, that really talks about like, you know, expanding like the quality of life and livelihood for like all people within a region or a city or something like that. Mm-hmm. You know, and they're really trying to go beyond this idea of mere like growth and economic growth and really talking about, you know, like the distribution of the benefits of the economy, including jobs, like as like a really fundamental kind of thing. So people who want to work or need to work have access to like well-paid jobs that support their dignity. Mm-hmm. You know, like, and you know, like, and they give them enough to be able to live on and work on, and you know, and to be able to grow themselves also. So my theory or my definition of economic development tries to encompass this whole thing about, hey, like, how do we expand opportunity and access for folks and better distribute the gains of economic growth? And in areas where we don't have growth, you know, how can we find a way to better distribute what gains and advantages are still there across those people who need it the most? So, you know, like, you know, that's like super kind of broad and expansive, but that's kind of where I go on it. So when I do hear a lot of people always talk about economic development, you know, like I do kind of like back up a little bit, because if you start to scratch the surface on it a little bit, oftentimes they're only talking about economic growth. And even then, like a really narrow set of economic growth. I think especially in the city, they really talk about like financial returns to real estate growth and like property value growth. And that to me is just like an entirely like insufficient measure to really think about economic development. And even some more slightly more sophisticated measures, I still think should be open to challenge. like the idea of like the like total number of jobs as a metric with no real question as to like what jobs are being made and who's actually going to be like getting those jobs down the line, you know. And if you were making like 200 jobs where folks are making like minimum wage in really dangerous conditions with like no benefits and something like that, you know, like, yes, people need work, but I feel like we can do better, or we should try and fight harder to make sure that people are able to get good work that doesn't like, you know, make them like more vulnerable or put them in danger or anything like that.
All right. See, I think that's thank you.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we've talked about this, I think, in one shape or form before, but I'm always frustrated by sort of the discussion of change, or how we're going to do this or that, and our own comfortability to gloss over the details,
right,
or just like, oh, well, you know, so we could get, you know, if we get economic development going, you know, and the implied idea is any number of outcomes, right?
Right, exactly.
It's not like, if we get the mean, you know, income level higher, you know what I'm saying, or we get the mean, the entry point to this certain wage level career, or blah blah blah, whatever it is. It's like, yeah, we just got to get the development going,
right,
and you know, not aware that, you know, you can, what is it? I want to say. Okay, was it Mismeasuring Our Lives? I think is the name of the book I read a ways back. I'm going to mess up the title, the writer. But basically, it was just the whole analysis, and this was written after like the 2008 bubble area, somewhere in there. And it's someone that people probably know that do these things that I can't remember his name right now. But in any event, the point of the text and the essay, I guess was sort of basically that the tools that we use to measure, you know, and the kind of the failings within those tools in terms of how that actually is reflecting people's lives and affecting their lives. From your perspective, you know, in community, and me as armchair economic researcher, listen to stuff guy. What is there a particular measure that you hear people either talk about or speak about that just sort of frustrates you as a person who may do a little bit more study on these things, and you worry on a public level, people are like, yeah, we need to do this because this number says that, and then you're like, yeah,
exactly,
like, maybe not.
Yeah, we could probably do better. So I think there are two. One that's used like most everywhere, and one that's used probably in more specific situations. The one that's used most everywhere is always like property values, and you know, like this idea that increasing property values or bolstering property values as like the end all major metric by which to understand stuff can really like narrow, number one, your understanding of what's actually going on, but it also narrows the potential like policies or approaches that you can be able to do, you know. And there are like real reasons for this, you know. I mean, like for cities that do not have the ability to have like a sales tax or something like that, like Portland, basically all of their revenue comes from property taxes. So for the city, there's a clear incentive to maximize their property values. And for the work that I do, looking at this kind of like urban manufacturing and urban industrial work, you know, I mean, like those are some of the like relatively like cheapest, or like those are like the like cheapest like tracts of land by square foot, depending on their use, right? So if you have like a factory or like a food processing joint, that building, assuming that it stays industrial, may sell for like $15 or $20 a square foot. But if you allow that building to go to like a commercial office or residential, you might be able to sell it at $30, $40, $50 a square foot, you know? Now, for any landlord who has that opportunity, you know, I'm not going to blame them if they sell, right? Like that makes a whole lot of sense. At the same time, I do wonder for planners, you know, to say, hey, you know, like, is this necessarily a good trade-off, you know? So it's like, hey, like, who's working there? What are they producing, and what's their actual like real impact on the city and the region as a whole beyond simply their property tax receipts, you know. And that's not necessarily a question that a lot of cities ask. I think more are starting to ask it now, you know, but there's strong incentives and reasons why they don't. And that's because, hey, they got to be able to like maximize these property taxes, right? And again, it puts them in a bind, but what that does is that, you know, like it forecloses certain forms of understanding and certain kinds of policies. And we see that, I think, like across the country in many kinds of ways. And it's very, very difficult for cities to try and get beyond this kind of like fiscal imperative. I think a slightly more specific example, at least what I do again, and trying to talk about like employment, urban manufacturing, urban industrial work, is this idea of job density. And job density, again, is just this kind of like measure, which is like, you know, like the number of jobs per like square mile or something like that, right? And I'm always very frustrated with that metric because that metric is like biased against like urban industrial work, right? So if you make something of any reasonable size, or if you make something at any like kind of like major scale, a whole lot of the space in your building is going to be made up of machines and not people, right? So by definition, like urban industrial work of all kinds is going to lose out on most job density questions, where you could maybe put like a building and you could have like 100 people in an office working as opposed to maybe 10 to 20 people in a factory, right? But the question still becomes, you know, like who is working those jobs? What are the quality of those jobs? And I always try to remind people, it's like, hey, look, you know, I mean, like those people who are working in that office, you know, like by definition, they probably have a college degree or maybe a graduate degree and all this other kind of stuff. You know, they're making between like $40,000 or $80,000 a year and all this other kind of stuff. For maybe those 10 or 20 people in that factory, maybe the vast majority of those folks do not have a college degree, but they're making between $30,000 and $40,000 a year, and they have benefits and they have vacation leave and all that other kind of stuff, right? And for those same people, if they wanted to come back when like that office comes, you know, they're going to be serving coffee or making and painting nails and things like that, you know, and the pay is going to be significantly less. They're probably not going to have those kinds of benefits that are afforded to those other kind of workers. Potential union representation is down and things like that. So for that particular segment of workers, you know, it actually may end up being a losing proposition, even though you may have like on net like more new workers who are moving, who are moving into the space, right? I mean, so there's this assumption that workers are these kind of like substitutable things, but you're actually dealing with like different segments of workers connected to different forms of land use. And like my like dissertation is trying to like tease out some of that stuff that's there, but that's something where a metric like job density, like it can't by definition really deal with that kind of like internal variation of who makes up workers in a particular space.
Have you, in your work and in your research, I know you do a degree of creating like quantitative ways to look at, you know, stuff that may not be easily seen as quantitative.
Right.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
What is I guess a particular challenge of trying to change something like, you know, the type of jobs people have or something like that into like some type of number concept?
Oh man, that's a great question. Actually, because I was wrestling with it for my presentation. But before I get to my presentation problem, I'll give an example where I think it was done really well. So, you know, the Upshot, the like blog, the New York Times blog, they've got some great data viz on there. But there was one, I think maybe like a month and a half ago or maybe 2 months ago, where they were talking about the changing nature of occupations. And they were talking about how, like, you know, like back in the 70s and the 80s when manufacturing was more dominant, a whole lot of occupations required more like manual labor kind of skills, right? And as time has gone on, more occupations now require more cognitive skills or emotional skills or something like that. And what they wanted to do to try and show that was was they made this quadrant, and on the x-axis, I think it was something where they had like the degree to which an occupation required like manual labor, and on the vertical axis, I think it might have been like the level of education required or something like that. Mm-hmm. And for each job, they just kind of like plotted like an average of these things, and you had this like really interesting little visualization of the kind of the different skills that different jobs require. And then they had this thing kind of like over time, and they showed how like the weight of these things like changes over time, I think by like the size of the dot or something like that, which corresponds, I think, to like the number of jobs, right? So over time, you can actually see that the skills that are required are like changing, and we're seeing this in kind of like new occupations that people now have to fill. Of course, the takeaway from that is that, people in the old occupations are still here and they still exist, right? But there's like fewer jobs that there are fewer jobs that require those things. And many of the newer jobs also require, like more formal education, things like that, right? So for areas that don't have, like a high number of people who are getting a college degree, there's like an ever shrinking number of available jobs in terms of what's going on. And I just thought that was like a really cool way of trying to visualize like a really like complex thing over time. Now, for me personally, what I'm working on right now for this presentation is, like I did this, like my first chapter is basically like a review of a whole bunch of zoning codes and comp plans, which, is like a mind-numbingly like tedious exercise in some ways. But I think it's kind of cool because I think I found some stuff that are going on. And I was trying to find some examples of like industrial protection zoning or land use policy. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. But basically what I did is that, I tried to identify cities that have these policies, and then I tried to kind of like map out the features of what those policies are. Mm-hmm. So I tried to say, hey, does this policy like further restrict or outright ban like office or residential or something like that in addition to what's already existing in the zoning code? Or does it require some new form of process? Like, does it require like a review from the city council or from Metro or something like that? And I was trying to find like a good summary graphic to try and show that. And what I ended up doing was, I have my cities on the y-axis, so it's going on like so the cities are going. So the cities are on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, I have the different policies. And I just have like a little colored block for each policy. So if a city has more policies, it has more blocks.
Okay.
Right? There are two issues with that. So the first issue is that, these are like policies. There's no real like rank ordering to them. So the blocks don't necessarily like touch each other. So a city may have only like two blocks, but the blocks might be in like the second position and the fourth position, right? Because their position depends on what the actual policy is, right? And there's not any like ideal like ordering of the blocks such that like every single city, if they have more than one, like each block would touch each other, right? So I don't know if there's necessarily an easy fix for that. But I'm still trying to wrestle with that. And the third thing is that, I've tried to divide these policies into like two subcategories. One is like on use. So again, does this thing ban or restrict residential or commercial? And on the other one for process, I'm just like, hey, it's like process. And one of my advisors was like, hey, and one of my advisors was like, hey, you could potentially change the color of the block to signal if this is like a use policy or a process policy. And then, so then that would show, like three different variables in like a 2-dimensional space, right? And that ends up being, like not the easiest thing in the world. I think especially trying to do it in a more like scripted or automated way that I like to do in R, because I think it would be possible to like manually color the blocks, and I may have to do that, but that's where really trying to think about, hey, like what's the best way to try and visualize like this like qualitative variation between cities, and it actually took like a good little bit to try and figure that out. I really just wanted like a table to start with, but the table was super busy, and tables itself are like a form of visualization. I was like, oh, instead of having like a check mark or a 1 or a 0, I could just make this a color. And it would be like much easier to see like the difference in terms of in terms of what's going on. So if it has it, it's got a color in it. If not, it's blank, and you can see easily like who has more stuff. And if you want to look wider out, you can see the variation in terms of what's going on. So I think it works like okay. I need to refine it for presentation, make it look really pretty. But so like qualitative data analysis or qualitative like data visualization, like qualitative visualization that way is like really difficult. But I think also can be like some of the more like some of the more like rewarding things that you can be able to find, and you can play around with it a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I think visual indicators of ideas are very important. I think it helps to move something that can seem very sort of like, oh, you gotta, if you're not tracking the words we're using, right, you can feel like you're not a part of the conversation. But if I'm, if I struggle with some of the words, but I look at all right, so he's saying this is connected to that, right? You know what I mean? Like people will put it together, and it may even help them to connect with the verbal aspect. Or and I used to work in a when I was in college many years ago. I worked in the library, and I saw all of the dissertations, and sometimes I would just grab one at random and look through it. And some of them were interesting. Yeah. Some of them were not. Some were, especially like obviously like the writing, the dissertations were just all words. There were nothing else to look at or think about. Right. Like, it was 500 words on Chaucer related to some other thing, modern something. You're like, yeah, we're not going to get through this. Yeah, exactly. Like, on the shift. Let me move to another section. But I think I think it's good for people to hear. Oh yeah. No, it is. And I know we're on a podcast, so it's not like the best medium to try and describe like explicitly like a visual thing. But yeah, I think like I'm a really big fan of data viz in all kinds of different ways. Because, I think we see it in so many different ways. It can be a very powerful tool of communication in terms of what's going on. Also, too, we're bombarded with really terrible or deceptive visualizations on like an everyday basis, right? So I also think there's also a thing too around like, hey, people should know what goes into them and how to better read them and things like that. So so the geographer in me is always like very like aware of like trying to look at maps and things like that, and trying to say, hey, like, can people read maps, or is this, or like, or trying to think about like what exactly this map is trying to show us, right? Because a lot of people take maps like on face value, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is easy to be deceived by them, or sometimes people just make sloppy maps that don't actually tell the tale that they think they're trying to, so I do think that people need to be like aware of how those things work out. All right. I think that opens a door for us to pivot towards Twitter. Mm-hmm. All right. So and I say this because I think that's a vector where people get the memes and the this and the that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a very visual medium, by definition. Yeah, I think. I guess the first thing I say is, it's what's your Twitter handle?
At Surly Urbanist, aka the Blackest Planner. Like.
And I'll say this, I'm still trying to get more. I guess I don't know if consistent is the right word with usage of Twitter, but like I'll jump on every couple days and just sort of go like, hey, it was, Yeah, and one thing that's always a delight is I'll come in and you're midstream talking about something, and I'll go, all right, that's interesting. And I'll click on your thing and try to figure out what the conversation is, to see if I can, tune in, listen for a little bit, or if I could add on, or just see, because it's always something that's like, man, who is he talking to? What is he talking about? And I think, Twitter as a vehicle, I think is very interesting, especially, I guess, Black Twitter. And people talk about Black people in Twitter. And I don't know if you have to do something to join Black Twitter besides be Black and on Twitter. Like anything, like any social gathering, even one that is sort of a virtual social gathering,
right?
You know, if you ain't been at the meeting, you should kind of wait your turn,
right?
To talk too much,
exactly.
You know what I mean, or to be like, yeah, you know what I'm saying. What else you need to know,
right.
How does Twitter just land for you? How do you feel about the Twitter?
Man, so like honestly, the thing for me for Twitter is like, and you know, people think I joke about it, but I'm dead serious. Like Twitter, like kept me in Portland. Like when I first moved out here, you know, like in 2011 or something like that, you know, like. Portland was like really, really lonely and like isolating in some ways, you know? And it was on Twitter because I think I had signed up for Twitter, I think like maybe a couple of years before I moved out here, but I hadn't really used it before. I didn't see much of the utility, but it wasn't until I came out to Portland and, you know, all of a sudden I got into Twitter again and I realized, oh man, there's like all these like college educated black people who are like my age who were like in North Carolina either for school or like from North Carolina or from the DC metro area, and they were all just down there and like I could talk with them and like we could share the same jokes and all the other kind of stuff, you know, and like it was really a space that allowed me you know, to really kind of like be me in a way that I couldn't necessarily be like outside within my department, you know. I mean, like there are certain jokes and the way that certain like language and things go, you know, and the way that we communicate with each other that wouldn't stick, that it just wouldn't stick in Portland where people would not get the references. And I was like, oh wow, so not only are you all like not black, but like 85% of you are coming from or grew up in areas where there weren't black people also. Right. So like, you know, I can't even expect you to be like a white person who is familiar with black people who could maybe like get this reference or this joke. So Twitter was really like a godsend for me on that, you know, and then I really didn't like come into what little bit of prominence I have on Twitter on like the urban thing until I had been here like a couple of years, you know, like, but Twitter for me first and foremost was like, oh, hey, like there's all these people out here who I wasn't really aware of. And there were even some folks who I actually went to college with and who I met like once or twice, but we never really hung out in college. But on Twitter, like we're really good friends now, right? And we actually like have met up and whatnot, and we've hung out like now because of our time spent together on Twitter, even though we were like at UNC at the same time, right? And I think that's really cool, and I think that Twitter actually like really does potentially open up like the creation of like real relationships with folks, you know, like, and to be able to expand your market in some really fruitful ways. So for me, like Twitter really did like you know, assuming that I defend successfully in the spring, like Twitter saved your doctorate. Yeah, exactly right. Which is like the exact opposite when you hear most people talk about Twitter and like graduate studies. They're like, oh my God, you got to get off here. It's absolutely distracting.
I would say, following you and then jumping in and then seeing like things that either things you've retweeted or things people you're communicating with are like, oh, I need to be following that. I need to follow that too.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think as a medium, in general, my feel on social media is what I feel about a lot of things in life. Like, it will either bring out something with you that is good.
Yep.
Right. Like, you'll use this tool in a way that's like, oh man, like I'm connecting with some people that are like minded, or I'm able to kick the ball around,
right,
and what have you. Or you will find a way to do something deplorable.
Yes.
With it. You know
yes.
what I mean?
Entirely.
And but I also think it's a very and this I think ties even back to even what I think is important about what you're doing in terms of your doctoral pursuits and whatnot, is that having someone moving into those worlds that will make decisions around, or at least people will turn to you like, you know, Jamal, can you review this? We want to draft a plan for developing the blah 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 blah.
Right.
You know, they're going to call in the doctor
to
come and either to actually help them craft a fair and equitable decision, or to at least rubber stamp whatever, you know, thing the developer brought in. Right. And hopefully you're there, you be like, man, I ain't rubber stamping that. That's, you know, trying to play me. You got to put my name on that.
Exactly.
I don't put my name on that.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And, you know, but it's important that folks that have the skills and the capacity are available to make these decisions, right? And to give the input and to develop the analysis, right? So all that is my circuitous route around to whether it's real or, whatever its limitations, it is a space where ideas are wrestled with.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, like, again, just because of like where I am, I guess, in my career and how I like approach Twitter, like I follow like a really awesome set of like black intellectual folks, and so some of these folks are in the academy, and some of these folks are in media, and some folks are just normal folks who just read a lot and think deeply about things, and are like really, really intelligent, and I've had amazing conversations with them. And like I haven't agreed with everything that everyone has always said, but like for folks who are like the real ones, like they always have something really interesting to say and really like some really fascinating stuff to do, and like they introduce you to new people to read and new ideas to wrestle with or new techniques to use, and that is like an invaluable thing, I think, as someone who wants to try and live the life of the mind. And again, like it's not to say that Twitter's like necessarily the perfect area for that. I mean, like there's certain ways in how it's built up that, it makes communication in certain ways very easy and other ways very difficult. So it's not perfect, but Twitter can be like a formative, fruitful place for your intellect. You just also need to know when you got to sign off and sit down and do some work, right?
Right, indeed.
And I mean, like, but I've had some amazing stuff. I mean, like, right, actually, in my bag, I have Tressie McMillian Cottom's book, Lower Ed, and I'm actually going to be like presenting a good bit of what that book says at this conference next week, right? Now, Tressie is cool, and she's people's, but Tressie is like a sociologist who studies for-profit colleges, and I am like an economic development planner, right? Like these are not really fields that touch and mix, but I think her work is like absolutely essential to the way that we start to understand like the way that certain labor markets are formed and things like that, and ultimately what that means like for regional economic growth and development. Right. And I really haven't seen anyone else in the planning field like really talk about the stuff that she's talked about. So I'm going to try and take next week to try and like to introduce her work to these economic development folks and try and say like why it's important, But I would not have known her if it were not for Twitter. Right. And that's just like an incredibly valuable thing in terms of like my own like development and ability to think about problems in some new and interesting ways, and be introduced to an entirely like new set of practitioners and theorists and writers and thinkers.
Do you think, because I think one of the things I think is very valuable about Twitter, it is basically, it is a way to be black in public that would be more difficult maybe than to do just depending on, definitely the major broadcasters, or even some of our, we do show up in the New York Timeses and the Washington Posts of the world. And what's the third paper these days? I guess the Wall Street Journal is still the other one. Okay. So, and those being the sort of national media apparatus. But just to have where someone, if they were interested, right, if they were interested in listening to a back and forth around something black people think about themselves, right, they could actually do it, right, which often exposes the lie that folks are not interested. They actually just want to comment on you in order to further their own thoughts. However, so I think that is an extremely valuable part of the space, and in the context of a society where it was quite literally illegal and many times to be black and not have nothing to do. Right. Like, different times I always be like, it's like, what, you ain't got nothing to do? Exactly. Go to jail. Yeah, exactly. And not in theory, people go look, Google, it's your friend. Look it up. It's called vagrancy. Like, basically, you are not allowed to be black and just be sitting here thinking. Right. The idea that there's this place where you can jump on, depending on what you search for or who you're already following. Right. There could be somebody that's black that's sort of like sitting and thinking and then going, you know what? Potatoes. You know what I'm saying? And then they go on a thing about potatoes for 20 minutes. Yeah, it's awesome. It's great. Like, that is a good thing, and it's a good thing to exist. I guess I would ask you, do you think there's a challenge in that as a platform, there's a platform that we invest a lot of energy into, that we don't necessarily control, although I feel that may be consistent about a lot of things.
Right.
Like, how do you feel about that? Is that something you ever think about?
I mean, it's kind of, I guess it's not like the paradox, but maybe the compromise that we all make, in this like capitalistic society or whatever, where it's like, hey man, like there's this social network and it's fun and it's quote unquote free, right? But but the thing that we definitely know is that, there's nothing actually free in a capitalist society if it's being, quote unquote, like given to you by a corporation whose job is to make money, right? And there's like this saying by folks who do kind of like the digital labor stuff or digital theory stuff where they're saying, hey, where they're basically like, hey, like if you don't know what you're buying, then you're the product. Right. And that's the thing for Twitter, right? So Twitter is quote unquote free, but Twitter is constantly like mining different bits of your activity and things like that to try and show you better ads or even selling that data off itself to different kinds of vendors and things like that, so they can better like target you to the different kinds of things. So that's kind of like a level 1. On the level 2, there's also the kind of like famous thing where, like people complain about the fact that like that the ideas, in particular of like black people, in particular like black women or queer black people, are quote unquote stolen on Twitter. And there's this claim, to certain kinds of like, there's certain like intellectual property claims that people want to make to certain kinds of things on Twitter around, say like T-shirts or even slang or certain kinds of approaches and things like that, and the kind of like dismissive, semi-condescending approach that some people have is that they say, hey, Twitter is the public sphere, you should just be aware of that, and that's just going to happen. And like that's not incorrect, but it's also not, I think, like a good way to try to engage with people on that kind of question. At the same time, like I do sometimes roll my eyes a little bit when I'm like, hey, like you've been like tweeting this thing, you don't have a trademark on it as far as I can tell, or you didn't think about putting a trademark on it, and now someone came and they threw it on a T-shirt or something like that, and this person's product may indeed be inferior to what you were thinking you wanted to do with it, but they were the first mover and they took advantage, and that's how it's going to go. And again, like that's what happens when you live in like a capitalist society where everyone is always like competing and trying to get over on you, on some other kind, on some other kind of thing. And, I don't necessarily know if having a quote unquote like black owned Twitter would change that. Right. And I do think that, like there are like some legit questions there as to like, what is the appropriate role in Twitter as like a creator or amplifier of certain kinds of culture, and who gets to profit from that culture. And I do think that that's like a very real kind of set of questions. I also know that that's not unique to Twitter. It's not a new thing. And black people have had their cultural production like exploited and taken advantage of by non-black people and even other black people, like basically since we set foot on this continent.
It's a built-in feature,
right,
of our at this point,
right,
where it's like if you, I've actually have had the feeling at times in my life where either with especially when I used to do music or something, or you're at an event and like if you and your my cohort you hear me tweet about it on Pedigree, we are together. And you feel like someone's looking at you like, oh man, those guys look cool.
Yeah.
You be thinking, wait a minute, man, they gonna take my cool and like go have a meeting later. Like exactly. They gonna go have a meeting later. Like, so I call this guy who's my friend, who's a cousin of this other person that's in production development, this other thing. No, exactly. And then like later you be like, man, did they just make that based off of seeing me doing something like probably on the cheap? More than likely, I'm gonna keep real with y'all, on the cheap. I do everything on the cheap. I'll put some stuff together. Exactly. You know what I mean? And then I don't know exactly how you fight that.
Right.
You know what I mean? But it is still something that's like, we gotta have something. We gotta have some way to fight that. And then there's also my concern of like, you don't want to turn every one of your interactions on the, like, I need to be thinking about how I'm going to profitize my communication. Right. So before I thought like, you put a copyright on the back of the, of the piece, those sorts of things. I think that there's always a risk for us in this free exchange of ideas as a group in a minority position,
right?
That other people are just like, swooping around, waiting, like, oh, word up, oh man, that's what they talking about.
Oh yeah,
let me get a T-shirt out. Let me just set up the you get them promoted ads, and it'll be like, I've seen promoted ads for all kinds of stuff that I know I've watched as kids, like now on a T-shirt. Exactly. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, are the people that came up with that, are they getting paid? They're probably not getting paid. I'm not gonna buy that T-shirt. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's very frustrating.
But yeah, I cannot remember which venue had the article. And that was this great article talking about old girl who started, the On Fleek movement, and she's like from around the way in Chicago or whatever, and she started the On Fleek thing in like a Vine video, and it just like took off, and like folks on Black Twitter were talking about Fleek this and it's on Fleek and all this other kind of stuff, and then like these, the culture vultures who watch Black Twitter for the next big thing, they come in, and now you have like On Fleek T-shirts and all this other kind of stuff. And I sit in my coffee shop in 2017, and I see, like these new moms who are coming from like the bar studio who are like, visibly look like middle to upper middle class white women. They're talking about how such and such is on fleek and who's throwing shade, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is how it goes, that's right?
So bizarre.
I think that the article did a really interesting job of trying to show, hey, the cultural products of minority youth, in particular, again, like women and queer youth, are often like taken advantage of. And I think that you made two great points. On the first was when you talked about how someone, because of their own like privilege or connections, they have like people in place to be able to take an idea and monetize it a whole lot faster than someone who may have something interesting, but they don't necessarily have those connections because of like a variety of reasons, right? So the girl who coined On Fleek, she's now, I believe she's now selling weave and things like that, and she's trying to make some living on everything, But On Fleek is nowhere to be found on her product. But I do see people when they talk about her product saying, hey, y'all, she gave us this like cultural phenomenon on Fleek, and she got nothing for it, and all these other people getting paid. So let's support her now, right? So that's kind of a recognition of the fact that there are these like structures and systems that allow certain folks who quite often tend to be, like wealthier and whiter than the people who create these things to be able to like put out these products faster and to put out those products to like a wider audience in terms of what's going on. On the second end, I think also your point too around the fact that it's like, hey, like Twitter would be a much worse place if everyone treated all of those all of those communications as commodities, right? And there's certain things that I feel like, like we shouldn't always be so concerned about trying to commodify everything and find a way to sell and get over on top of something, right? Now, again, if you don't have money or you don't have work and you're not working and you got to figure out how to be able to hustle something, then yeah, man, like, hey, and I'm like, how can you turn these tweets to cash, right? And that's fine. But, I think Twitter would be a much more boring place, a much more restrictive place if everyone thought that every potential tweet was going to be like the next big thing or could potentially be able to make them like, like a few $1,000s here or a few $1,000s there.
Right.
And it just, it like, I think that would take away of a lot of like the flexibility and fun and the fact that people on Twitter can continually like go over like certain kinds of tweets and aspects and put their own little twist on it. And that's what makes Twitter fun, is when folks just start going, right? And we see like how like extreme or twisted they can turn something out. And it all starts with like this one thing. And that's part of the fun. And like, it's actually part of the things that like really made Twitter like very fun for me, was just seeing like how like witty and cutting a lot of folks were on certain stuff. And if you're, and if the original poster is forever concerned about like, the proper like use permissions for that kind of thing, it just utterly destroys the ability for Twitter to be that kind of like creative ecosystem.
Right. I think it's it's almost to me and we're good on time. We got probably about, we're good on time.
Okay.
It's like, what was it? I feel like our society has a struggle between sort of like capitalism as it is as a vehicle and as a concept of a way you do business or whatever, right? But then also the stuff that should be sort of like, we share that, right? And I think it's somewhat of the challenge in terms of folks who, have as I like to say to my socialist brothers, like I intellectually think I understand what you're saying we need to do. The behaviors that would be involved, I'm not 100% sure if I understand how that's going to work. Right. And so, but if that concept, if that challenge is around sort of like what's public and what's a space where we're just having free communication, and then what's this point where I get to go, oh, I own that. Right. If that's, because I think that in some ways is the tension. If we, it's like, I guess I'll use a music analogy. Like if you used to rap, right? Right. So if you're with people that's rapping and y'all are like, everybody goes to this radio show to do freestyles. So if in that freestyle session you say something or you come or you hear something someone else says and it makes you think of like a whole song or a thematic, deeper thematic concept, and you go home and you flesh that out and you make it something bigger. There sometimes could be a space where the other person might be like, oh man, he got that idea from me, right? And it's like, I might have got the idea from you, but all this other stuff I did with the idea, I did that. You know what I mean? Like I went and thought about it and I did these other things.
There is real labor involved in terms of like doing something new with it, right? And that's different than theft,
right? That's different than me hearing you say. And that's for your mama. And then I go and I make the That's for Your Mama t-shirt. And did you hear what's the name on the radio last week? You want to get the That's for Your Mama t-shirts. Exactly. You got to holler at your boy. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to be on Penn Avenue. You know what I'm saying? You're going to see me on MLK. I'm going to be right out there. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's like, damn, dog. Like, you really going to play? Like we in community would go, nah, you need to at least partner.
That's right.
Yeah, you need to call the person that said it and give them a break. Give them a piece. And, the macro society, there's definitely a cultural attitude among some folks that it just goes, nah, I'm gonna give you nothing, right? And that to me speaks to a value system and one that needs to be challenged, and for the people that subscribe to that values that need to say them, like, nah, that's kind of whack. Like, if you at least give me an opportunity to get a check, I might not be mad if you want to make. I might think making t-shirts is corny, right? But if somebody else wants to wear an on fleek t-shirt, that's their business. That's a personal style decision. Exactly. But at least you could have called me, and if I'm the on fleek lady, and give me a kickback. Exactly. You know what I mean? That didn't cost you nothing. You know what I mean? Well, I guess it would cost you something, but it wouldn't cost you that much. Right. You know what I mean? I guess you could say, in the broader context of fairness, right? You gave an opportunity. Right. Do you think? And I think maybe this, because I think we have so much interaction on Twitter around issues, but then there's also stuff that's just fun. You know what I mean? Like, I don't watch award shows. Like I haven't watched an award show like intentionally since I don't know, like the 90s sometimes. Exactly. But other people, like, I know when one's on because I go on to Twitter and people are like,
BET Awards nights on Twitter are some of Twitter at like its absolute finest. It is absolutely hilarious, and everyone does it, right? And it really is like being in like a giant living room, and everyone's watching, everybody's cracking jokes or talking about performance, something like that. And it's really, really fun. And it's like you're there, and like, I hadn't thought about the BET Awards in years, but best believe on like that Sunday night and Twitter's popping, like I'm on there, like I'm on there and I'm following it, and I don't even watch the awards. Like I'm watching Twitter,
right? To see what they say.
Exactly, right? It's great, man. Like I think, that for me is Twitter at its most pure, like pure and joyous self.
Yeah. I guess to close on Twitter, do you think? Because I've seen this because we come up with stuff that's funny, and it's always. Usually, eventually, somebody go like, "Y'all need to stop laughing and get about this revolution we about to have." That really, for me, I find that frustrating because I think that that especially amongst some of the very high stress situations that we can have, and like having a moment to laugh has value. Where does that sit for you when you like experience that sort of like moment?
Well, no, I mean, again, I think it all depends on the context. Like, I fortunately have been in a spot where most times if the jokes are going, there's not someone who's coming up like, well, you know, like there's like famine in some other kind of place, blah, 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 blah. Because a lot of people understand like, hey, this isn't necessarily the appropriate spot to do that. Yeah. Right. You know, but there definitely have been some times, I think actually on the opposite end. I think especially around some of these like police shootings and things like that, where, you know, like folks are like really like talking about it, or they're trying to process it in their own way on Twitter, and someone tries to come in with some jokes, and it's like, yo, man, this is not the time nor the place. And that actually upsets me more. Right. And that's what I see more of in terms of people violating on that end than necessarily like the Debbie Downer or whatever who says, oh yeah, you know, I mean, like, this is all funny and everything, you know, like, but 30 people got shot last weekend in Chicago, and it's like, bruh, like, we're aware, yeah, dude, like, I mean, that's not good. At the same time, you know, like, we're gonna talk about Kanye and these snacks, and it's all jokes, like, and it's fine, right? Like, it's perfectly fine. So, you know, on that end, I'm definitely on the like, yo, bro, just chill out. It's fine. Like, it's actually not that serious, and it's not going to hurt you that much to enjoy these jokes right now. Because I tell you, like, you know, again, like tomorrow we all got to get up and go to work, and it's going to be serious again. And there's a bit of, you know, and the revolution or the movement hasn't been lost because we've taken a couple hours to laugh.
All right. Indeed. Thank you. So we have a pivot point. In my mind, we were going to try to talk about wage theft, which I think is despicable.
Well, man, I wish we had opened. Like, wish we'd opened with that. Yo, I could have brought some tables.
I mean, I would be open to the idea of us coming back together at a later date and just dedicating the whole day to wage theft, because I think it's the most despicable thing that a person, especially in a so-called capitalist society,
right? Oh yeah,
that's the, you know. So. I'm going to start steering us towards our exit, and with that, I usually like to talk about a little bit of movies, a little bit of music, maybe.
Cool. All right.
Which one you want to go with? Music.
I'm better on movies.
All right, let's go movies. All right. So, can you share what's just a movie that has the potential to, say, derail your work for a couple hours if you had not known it was going to be available to you, but then it presents itself?
Oh, it is. Oh, that's a really great question. Oh man, I'm trying to think. Okay, yeah. So for me, it'll probably be like a martial arts, like an action movie, like an action-oriented martial arts movie. And man, I'm trying to think. Like, there are a couple that I'll watch each and every time. So, okay, I'll split it up. So, for Western action, although it's not even really Western, it's actually more Eastern with just a Western lead, it would be the first John Wick. Like, I think Keanu Reeves was absolutely brilliant in it. I think the choreography is absolutely amazing. It's stylish, you know, like, it's just like a great story. And if I come in and it's like reasonably early in the movie, like, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch Keanu Reeves kill like 150 people, right? You know, like, and I just absolutely have to do it. On the Eastern end, man, like, again, it really depends. Like, you know, there's some absolute classics for me. But I would say, you know, most any Jet Li or Donnie Yen led flick, like, I'm going to stop and I'm going to watch. Doesn't matter, like, what it is. Right. And probably for Jet Li, I think my favorite of his is Fist of Legend, which is like kind of like his take on the Chinese Connection by Bruce Lee, you know, and he's just got like these great like scenes in there where he's beating up, you know, like 30 Japanese cats at a time. And also on that end, I guess on the Donnie Yen end of things, is like, if I walk in and Ip Man is on, I'm going to watch it every single time. And, you know, like you know, that's the movie that's going to grab me. And for the last one, so that's like 3. Like the fourth one, like, and like a non-action one that I really, really like, because it speaks to kind of my nerdy sensibilities, but I think it's like really well composed, is Spotlight, about the and that's about the team that exposed the Catholic sex abuse scandals in Boston, the investigative reporting team there, you know, and, you know, it just like, it's a very like nerdy movie in the way that, you know, kind of like focuses on the process of the investigation. And there's this scene that speaks to my heart because I've had to do it, where they go through these like diocese yearbooks, and they go back to like the 1950s, and they're tracking the movement of priests within the Boston diocese from like 1960 to like 1990, and they're literally just sitting there and they're like going in Excel and they're just like typing this stuff in, and I'm like, I've had to do that, and I really respect it. And I was just something like, I don't know why that scene like excites you so much, but like Spotlight is a movie where, you know, like, I mean, like, it's really, really heavy, but, you know, like, you have these folks who are, you know, like, they stumble upon this thing and they just like hold on to it like a bulldog, and then they run it out, and, you know, it creates this huge realization across the world, you know, which is like kind of brought the Catholic Church to its knees in many ways. And it's just like an incredible story. So yeah.
All right, damn, yeah. I have not seen Spotlight. I've seen about it.
I would heartily recommend it.
I gotta get it. I'm definitely an Ip Man and Fist of Legend fan, and I enjoy those greatly. Actually, I think I have I have like a box version of Ip Man that a family friend has given us that lives in Hong Kong.
Oh, nice. Yeah, yeah.
And
the sequels also aren't bad either. The sequels are not bad.
Yeah, I enjoyed a couple of those. Did he fight Mike Tyson in one of those? Yes.
Yes. And it's a pretty good fight.
Yeah, it is.
Like, it's a pretty good choreographed fight.
I think John Wick is the movie that I had on I gotta watch John Wick, and then like I didn't watch it, and it was on like the HBO Go, one of those, and it's not on there right now. So then I went to look for it, like on the like Redbox or somewhere one night, because I was like, I'm gonna watch it, because then like the new one came out.
Yeah,
I was like, I want to see the new one, but I want to watch the new one, so I watched the first one.
Right.
So you got me. I gotta watch both of those. Man, I like a good fighting movie though.
No, it's good. It's really, really good. And like, you know, this is another thing on Twitter I've gone off like immediately. Like a lot of Western action movies, I don't like the way they do hand to hand, at least in terms of like the filming, because oftentimes the actors aren't athletic enough to make good hand to hand look well, which is why I love like Hong Kong action or Indonesian action or something like that. But John Wick, because Keanu Reeves, number one, is like a phenomenal athlete, even at like 50-something years old, and he got people who like to film action and who want to show him off as like an athlete. Like, you know, he's up there, he's like throwing cats and he's kicking people and he's breaking stuff and he's shooting all at the same time. You know, and he's doing it like in real time, and it's fantastic to see.
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, just unexpected. You got an Iron Fist take?
Oh,
I mean, just on action.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of action, it was okay. I appreciate Iron Fist as like a stylistic thing, and I appreciate the RZA who like loves the genre doing his take on it. The RZA is not an athlete who can necessarily lead like an action movie, right? But that's fine. I mean, like, I still enjoyed the movie. I haven't watched in a couple of years. Like, I prefer that it exists as opposed to like non-existent. I still haven't seen the second one. I've got it like in my you know, like there's like I think I've had it in my Netflix queue for like 2.5 years. Like I just haven't watched it. Yeah, but yeah, you know, like, I mean, like, I really dug it. I mean, if we're going to talk about like RZA vehicles for that, you know, I really recommend actually like Ghost Dog.
Yeah,
I like
Ghost Dog.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's
much more. I enjoyed Ghost Dog.
Yeah, no, I really, really liked it too. Yeah. And like, and Ghost Dog is one of those things too, where it's like it was super understated, and I think it was like independent. Yeah. And I you know, like, it came out when I was in high school, so it's one of those like kind of formative tales, you know. But like, I really thought Ghost Dog was going to like change the game immediately, but it kind of got like, I think, forgotten or disappeared. Yeah. But there's like some really like fascinating stuff in there, and the soundtrack is phenomenal. You know, like
soundtrack is off the hook. Yeah. I think I guess I would say it's interesting because I think with and this, you know, be my close thing. I'm sensitive to not people being critical because I believe in critique as a basic human thing, that it's good actually for you to get better. I don't like the dismissive attitude sometimes, especially around like folks in our community when they make something and maybe it's not great. Like, maybe it's like, okay, it's pretty good.
Right.
Could use some work.
Right.
And then it'll be like, you should have never did it. They'll be like, whoa.
Exactly.
Like, you have permission to not do well in public. It's okay to make something and it not be good.
Exactly.
Like, if you were trying. So I was going, you know, as an action movie, there's like parts of it I enjoy, and there's parts of it I'm like, well, I still love you anyway, RZA. It's all good.
Yeah. No. It's exactly, like, entirely, like, you know, and again, like, as with many things in the black community, you know, like, we suffer disproportionately from many different kinds of things. And, like the penalties to failure in the black community oftentimes are much greater because, like many black people don't necessarily have like a safety net to fall on. Right. And that's kind of like a more like materialist kind of thing, like something like that. But that also does breed a certain kind of like conservatism around certain forms of experimentation around like most any kind of thing, and people are like, well, I told you not to do that thing in the first place, right? But like you can't advance if you don't try, and we have to be able to have room for failure. It's just people forget that you need to have support in order to be able to have room to fail. And if you don't have that kind of support, then it doesn't make any sense to try something that may ever fail. And that's and that's ultimately actually how you like cage your own ambitions and creativity and the ability to try and think about something that's like beyond like the current limits. So no, like I entirely agree with you. Like we gotta have that space and imagination to fail and support for folks. And that doesn't mean you gotta like it, and it may not work, but that does mean that because someone fails, that they shouldn't ever be able to have like another chance at something, right? But I do get tired when I see some like certain like prominent white folks, especially in sports, where you're like, hey, this coach has failed at like 4 other franchises, and he's at like franchise number 5, and these like
failing again.
Yeah, for real. And it's like you have all these black assistant coaches who will never sniff a head coaching job, right? But you got all these like serial failing like older white dudes who go like from head coaching position to head coaching position. It's appalling in that area. Right?
I think it's I guess was funny. Just I guess to touch on that, and on that particular note, I was watching the Oregon-Washington State game, and I know that sometimes they have to say something about the persons that there, but like Mike Leach for whatever is like, not only is he like, yes, he's made them a competitive team again, mm-hmm. but he's also had these like really like ethical things go on, and not just like not doing good at football, but like ethical things happen. Place where he was in charge, and it was just sort of weird at one point in the telecast, because they were sort of like, talking about like the air raid, crazy offensive genius thing. Exactly. And I was sort of thinking like mad scientist type dip, and I was sort of thinking like, what about the whole ethics thing? Yeah. Okay, I'm just gonna let this. I'm just know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go back to my little football nap and tune this out. Exactly. I mean, but it was just sort of weird when you hear that, and hoping like. I look forward. Well, one, I don't know if I really want the day where like a black head coach of some sort, or a black has this like he's such a technician of the but he has these ethics things over here that's like we're just gonna ignore all that other stuff over here.
And it's like and I mean like I too would like to imagine a day where a black head coach can like imprison his athletes in a porta potty, right? Was it that was at the contention, or a shed of some sort? I think it was either like a shed or a closet. But I too would like to see a day where a coach can physically and verbally abuse his athletes and land on his feet like Mike Leach, and then and only then will we have true equality.
That's right. That's the goal. That's the vision.
It's just like that's a bit perverse, but
it's slime time, man. So word up to Big Bird. Well, anything for the road or the record before I close this out?
Yeah. So I forgot to shout out my little brother and sister, Matt and Jasmine, who are like doing big things right now, like on back east and whatnot. And I would tell folks who are considering getting on the Twitter and not sure what to do, I always tell people, hey, you should get on Twitter and find your people and then have it adjust from there. Like I tell people all the time, like, I hear people like, well, like I want to get on Twitter to like help my job, and it's just like very useless and boring to me. And I'm like, well, that's because like that's not really a great way to do it unless you have like a great strategy, right? Like you should get on, you should tweet, you should find your company, and then you'll find your flow, and then from there you can make your connections and go from there. But like try and have some fun. And also too, you should buy and read Tressie McMillian Cottom's book, Lower Ed. It's dope, and she's talking about like a really, really big thing, like in for-profit educational institutions that have a massive impact on the black community, and that just kind of like flow underneath the radar. So yeah.
All right. Well, Jamal,
shout out to Tressie.
Shout out to her. One love, Pizza Street. Jamal, thank you for joining me. This has been the Ask Your Head. I can't even talk. This has been the Ask Your Head podcast with Justice Raji. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Stream PDX, where we're recording today. Thank you to Open Signal, which is a great community resource here in Portland. Access your community resource stuff. It's actually in the agreement for your local cable companies. They have to pay for this stuff. Like, it's in there. I used to work on those places. You should look anyway. In all things, be successful and have a good one. Peace.